Hi everyone, we're back. Walden on Wheels, Chapter 4, Tour Guide.
Tour Guide. Summer 2006, Coldfoot, Alaska. Debt, $32,000. If you were to smooth your hand over the Arctic's contours, your palm would roll over smooth green hills, your nails would claw into the moist fields of moss and sedge, and your fingers would run through bristly spruce groves. But you'd likely pause for thought when your fingertip landed on Coldfoot, a grotesque, relationship-ending mole, a protuberance that seems out of place on the Arctic's otherwise unblemished body. Today, Coldfoot is little more than a tire shop, a trucker's cafe, a small post office, a family-run bush plane air service, a ranger station, and of course, the 52-room motel that Paul and I cleaned the previous summer. Upon opening the doors to their rooms, the tourists, depending on their disposition, will either laugh good-naturedly or mutter obscenities about the austere accommodations. The sarcophagus-sized showers, the cigarette-burned carpets, the paper-thin wood-paneled walls, and the Nixon-era psychedelic orange bedspreads. The buildings, spread out and sprawled at strange angles, look like they've been haphazardly dropped from the sky. Surrounding them are the rusted relics of the town's industrial past. Ramshackle mining equipment, abandoned trailers, derelict trucks. The motel and cafe are separated by a large, muddied, potholed parking lot where the semis, when parked parallel to one another, look like packages of frankfurters. The cafe, built in the 1980s by truckers who dropped off their empty packing crates, has a certain degree of charm, but doesn't exactly cancel out the camp's other industrial eyesores. Indian and Eskimo tribes had roamed across the Brooks Range for thousands of years, but never were there permanent towns in the Arctic until the Alaskan Gold Rush. In 1898, Coldfoot became one of many boom towns where gold miners, too late to be among those who gathered the gleaming bounties of the Klondike, set out from to find mines in remote pockets of Alaska. At its height, Coldfoot was home to 7 saloons, a gambling hall, 2 roadhouses, a post office, and 10 prostitutes. But by 1912, after all the gold had been mined, the miners had disassembled the cabins and transported the logs 17 miles upriver to a new town called Wiseman, which is still standing today. Coldfoot remained deserted until the mid-1970s, when the oil industry built a camp there to house workers who'd pieced together the Alaskan pipeline, which stretches 800 miles from the oil fields in Prudhoe Bay on Alaska's northern coast to Valdez on Alaska's southern coast. To build the pipeline, the oil industry also built a 416-mile dirt road called the Dalton Highway that connected the city of Fairbanks to Prudhoe Bay. Coldfoot, situated halfway in between, was an ideal spot for a truck stop and is, today, one of the very few places where there are people year-round in the Alaskan Arctic. During the busy summer tourism season, Coldfoot's population triples to 35. Typically, the crew is made up of college students and recent grads who work to pay tuition or their debts, but there are also a few middle-aged, carny-like drifters who make a life out of seasonal work, jumping from camp to camp every few months. The day the summer crew arrived, we gathered by the river, built a huge fire from empty pallets and driftwood, and drank cheap whiskey straight from the bottle. Many of the workers from the previous summer had returned. There was Jordan, a thick-set, dark-skinned 30-year-old maintenance grunt who was born in India and raised in Alaska. He had 22 brothers and sisters, 15 of whom were adopted, who'd all grown up in a tiny village to the south called Joy. Ray, a dishwasher in his early 30s, was a Laotian-American schizophrenic and alcoholic from Texas who lived in the room next to mine in the dormitory. At any hour of the day, I could hear him talking to himself through the walls in between swigs of Canadian Club. Every evening, in a drunken stupor, he'd kick open the hallway doors and sputter fake bullets that sprayed from a pair of invisible machine guns that he carried on each arm. On the other side of my dorm wall was Avery, an 18-year-old waiter from the suburbs of Utah, who spent the whole summer in the hazy days of a marijuana high. Between him and Ray, Avery was the kinder, gentler, mind-altered neighbor whose guitar strums and bong bubbles canceled out the unnerving voices I'd hear coming from Ray's head. Then there was Curnow, the carpenter, a spitting image of Popeye's bearded, muscle-bound arch-nemesis, Bluto. Curnow brought with him his arsenal of automatic weapons, which he'd fire into a dirt mound behind camp. Chad, a red-bearded 33-year-old tour guide, was the much-loved, quick-witted Fonzie of camp and one of the few year-round Coldfoot residents. Behind the motel was the dog lot, which was home to his 30 Alaskan Huskies that he'd mush in the winter. Natalia, one of the few girls in camp, was a 21-year-old Ecuadorian student who worked as a lodge cleaner to make money for tuition. One day, she knocked on my door in a white dress, asking if I wanted to practice my Spanish. There were others in Coldfoot, but no one intrigued me more than an old man in his 70s. His name was James. He lived nearby and worked for the Bureau of Land Management, cleaning the outhouses on the highway. I'd spotted him walking across the camp in the early hours of the morning. He had a long, curly, white-as-death beard, a gaunt, wiry frame, and a spry, stilted gait. It amazed me that, for such a small town, I couldn't find anyone who'd spoken with him. I'd only heard strange rumors that he ate nothing but bizarre organic substitutes and lived in a copse of spruce trees on the edge of camp in his 1980 Chevy Suburban. It was my job to drive the tourists up the Dalton Highway on a 6-hour van tour through the Brooks Range. The tourists had signed up for an Arctic mountain safari, but the name of the tour was more than misleading, considering that we didn't get out. They'd been herded around so much on cruise ships, buses, planes, and trains that being herded around in a van was nothing new. When they arrived on Holland America or Princess Cruises tours, they would stagger off the bus, seldom knowing where they were or who'd brought them. Once, a frosty-haired lady in her 80s pursued me threateningly with her cane, screeching, "Where am I? They never tell me where I am!" Many were, as another guide put it, forklift fat, the sort of obesity that might require heavy machinery and funeral plans. On more than one occasion, I was asked to place my hands on a large Australian lady's bottom so she could be pushed into the van. On the van tour, I'd tell them about the history of Coldfoot, the habits of the Arctic animals, and the geology of the mountains, which I'd read up on. We'd scan the hills and sometimes spot a caribou, but I always wonder, is this their idea of travel? I thought real travel was about spontaneity and adventure. That sort of travel, though, was the last thing they wanted. Yet, I couldn't help but feel sympathy for them. Many only had a couple of weeks of vacation each year, and this tour was all they could afford or had time for. The retirees had worked hard their whole lives and no longer had the energy or strength to do more than this. 2 weeks after my first tour, I got a paycheck in the mail. I took a deep breath and opened it. It was for $300. Okay, not bad, I said to myself. Just $31,700 more to go. The season started slowly. In May, I was putting in a solid 40 hours a week, mainly getting trained on how to guide a tour and oar a big blue raft. By June, I was off on my own, driving a 14-passenger white tour van up the Dalton, oaring a raft down the Koyukuk, and working a respectable 50 hours a week, which provided me with some much-desired overtime wages. By July, my work week was up to 60 hours, and while I was happy to be bringing in the big bucks, I also began to mourn the loss of my free time, but I accepted it as a necessary sacrifice. By August, it was up to 70. I wasn't just guiding anymore. Several workers had deserted camp, so I was now making meals in the kitchen, hastily assembling extra co-worker tent cabins for the next season, and helping the cleaners catch up on turning rooms. Some days, work started as early as 5 a.m. and didn't end till 11 p.m. Alaska, which I'd once imagined as a refuge from the 9-to-5 working world, turned out to be just as bad. It feels almost blasphemous to admit hating work. It's true that people often complain about working 12-hour days, balancing 2 jobs, or suffering through double shifts. But it seems our complaints are often just thinly veiled boasts about how busy our lives are, as if having no time for leisure, for good night's sleep, or to do the things we actually want to do is some virtuous sacrifice we should all strive to make. I may not have admitted it to anyone else, for fear of sounding entitled or ungrateful or whiny, but I hated work. I hated waking up early, hated taking orders, hated spending the great bulk of my time doing something for somebody else, hated how the hours would go by, hated how the days would melt into one another. I didn't consider myself above work, but it just seemed so silly to have to work, perhaps for the next decade, and put all my earnings towards something as intangible and clearly unprofitable as my college education. And while I did think there was something crooked about the system, a system that charged unreasonable amounts of tuition to teenagers who only wished to better themselves and their society, I knew that I was responsible for taking out the loans and paying them back. I despised having to work now more than ever because my situation was so pathetic. After 5 years of college, 2 unpaid internships, and $32,000 of debt, I was just as unmarketable. Come work I'd been doing for years. Although I was working for a wonderful company with a wonderful group of people, my actual work didn't appear to have any of the positive qualities of good employment. It wasn't a way for me to climb the ladder to a better career. It wasn't helping me grow or develop. I wasn't spending my working hours basking in the warmth of job satisfaction by having spent my day making a useful product or providing a necessary service. I was in the tourism industry, so I was little more than a provider of luxuries and satisfier of desires. Ultimately, I was pointless. I didn't see work, at least my line of work, as a virtuous undertaking. Rather, I saw it as nothing but a penance for my sins, for the profligate decisions I had made as a clueless 18-year-old. I thought of my job as nothing but frivolous toil, the only thing keeping me from living the free life I now dreamed of mountains and books and adventures and independence. I was ungrateful to have a job, yes, but I was grateful to have a life with which I might do better things. I could have easily justified that I was lucky to even have a job, unlike millions of other grads, or that I was better off than the 20-somethings who were starving, had AIDS, and were fighting a war somewhere in Africa. But I didn't want to make the best of a bad situation. To make the best of a bad situation seemed like an act of resignation. Instead, I embraced my bitterness and hatred and ungratefulness. Ungratefulness, I thought, was my only ticket out of debt and jobs like this. And so, without time to visit the mountains or savor the books and lectures and higher things that kept me mostly sane in college, I relied on the blackout qualities of alcohol I'd lustily drink at weekly riverside extravaganzas, when we'd drink until we couldn't think of work or debts or troubles anymore. In June, for my 23rd birthday, one of the chefs, Carla, who'd given all the males in camp stripper nicknames, mine being Kenny G-String, awarded me with a G-string she'd made out of velvet and muskrat fur that she'd acquired from a local trapper. After my 8th Miller Lite, egged on by a cheering crowd, I donned my present, wearing my G-string over my jeans like a washed-up Arctic superhero. I can say from experience that when you wake up on a weekly basis with cottonmouth, a throbbing hangover, and a dead muskrat on your crotch, you can't help but question the direction your life is headed in. I became obsessed with destroying what I thought was most constraining me. The debt wasn't a mere dollar amount. It was a villain that needed to be vanquished, a dragon that needed to be slain, a windmill that needed to be toppled. I thought of the debt as if it was the only thing keeping me from really living. It was the only thing on my mind. Nearly every dollar I made went toward my loans. I bought nothing and kept nothing in the bank. I squealed with pleasure when I tortured it with payments, like a sadist plucking legs from a captured mosquito. On the drive back to Coldfoot on the van tours, we would stop at Wiseman, the historic mining village just 13 miles north of Coldfoot. In the 1930s, Wiseman was home to 375 Eskimos and white settlers, but today, there are only 15 people there, living largely subsistence lifestyle. Hunting moose, caribou, grizzlies, and Dall sheep, growing vegetable gardens, foraging for blueberries and cranberries, and creating their own electricity with solar panels, as well as with wind and diesel generators. Many of the cabins, made of stacked birch logs, are still standing from Wiseman's boomtown days. They are crowded by raspberry bushes or giant clusters of blue delphiniums. Rooftops are made of sod or shingled with old rusted tin oil containers or hidden under large solar panels. There are moose antlers hanging above doors, hunting caches, which looked like mini cabins on stilts, and vegetable gardens bursting with heads of lettuce and the greens of potatoes and carrots that would feed the townspeople for the long winter. My company paid one of the Wiseman locals to show the tourists his subsistence lifestyle. Jack Reekoff was in his late 40s, yet he didn't look a day older than 35. He had a sturdy frontiersman's carriage and wore a necklace made of wolf teeth and a belt buckle made of Dall sheep horn. He'd lived in Wiseman ever since he was a boy and had grown up hunting, trapping, and fishing in the Arctic's woods and rivers. As a young man, he attended the University of Alaska at Anchorage for a semester to study biology, but quickly realized that there was no better classroom or teacher than that which he'd just deserted, the great outdoors. He came back to Wiseman and raised a family, embracing the Arctic and the subsistence lifestyle that he'd never desired to desert again. Jack would lead the tourists around town and invite them into his two-room cabin. Inside were mounted heads of Dall sheep and a grizzly. The walls and ceiling were covered with pictures of his family and maps of Alaska. The room smelled of soot, fried caribou, and body odor. Every day I'd listen to Jack tell the guests about his lifestyle. I was his secret pupil, learning everything there was to know about subsistence living in the Arctic. His was the most northern garden in America. In it, he grew hundreds of pounds of potatoes, cabbages, turnips, beets, kale, and carrots, which he'd cover with clear plastic during the cold summer nights. Underneath makeshift tarpaulin greenhouses, he grew zucchini, tomatoes, and peppers. He preserved his winter vegetables in his refrigerator, which was a hole in the floor of his cabin that remains 40 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. He killed trees that had reached full maturity and then harvested the wood on his snow machine years later when the logs were dry enough for the stove. He ran trap lines and sold furs. He hunted and fished and repaired his own machinery. To supplement his subsistence lifestyle with money, he did these tours with Coldfoot guests for an hour or two every day during the summer. I was having my first man crush. I envied Jack's lifestyle. It was the sort of lifestyle that makes a man self-reliant, intelligent, strong. A lifestyle in which no one ever had to think of the Dow Jones, the unemployment rate, punch cards, or bosses. Jack's work and leisure, his toil and enjoyment, were one and the same thing. His work was his life, and his life was his work. Every day was a work day. Every day was a vacation. And he wasn't working in abstractions or pulling levers for some morally ambiguous corporation. His hands were in the dirt, occupied as he was with the duties of feeding his family and warming his home. I could see that Coldfoot and Wiseman, as well as myself and Jack, were polar opposites. One town relied on trucks to bring food and fuel in from Fairbanks. The other created its own. One town had wage slaves. The other, people as free as people can conceivably be. Each town represented two types of living, two types of working. They represented the life I currently had to live and the life I wanted to live. While I was getting paid plenty of overtime, $9 an hour was still my base wage, and I wondered if I'd made a mistake coming to Coldfoot. Perhaps if I'd looked harder, I could have found something that paid better and didn't demand so much of my time. I was, however, able to pay the debt off quicker than I originally thought, partly because my mother had offered to put my high-interest bank loan, $17,000, on her interest-free credit card. My mother had perfect credit, allowing her such a card. This meant that, for this loan, I'd no longer be paying back a bank, just my mom. This arrangement was advantageous to me because the interest on this loan would no longer accrue, and it wouldn't cost my mother a thing. In addition to the $17,000 loan my mom had put on her credit card, I had another $15,000 government loan. Paying my two loans was a simple process. The payments for the government loan were automatically deducted from my bank account. Because I wanted to pay back my mom first, I paid the minimum on these government loans, $114 a month, about half of which would go toward accumulated interest. Every week, I'd mail my checks home to my mom, and she was supposed to put all the money toward my loans on her credit card. Our arrangement was working fine until one day, in the middle of summer, when I viewed my bank account on Coldfoot's shared computer and realized that she was putting the money not toward the debt, but in my bank account. I thought of my dollars like Spartan soldiers trained from birth to die in battle with debt, unconcerned with the likelihood of defeat. Yet here they were in my account, doing nothing, living it up like drunken sailors peeing on one another in port. I called my mother to find out what was going on. "I see that you've gotten my checks," I said to her over the phone, trying to remain composed. "But they haven't been put toward the debt. How come?" "Well, I put them in your bank account," she said sweetly, "because I thought it would be good for you to have some money just in case. You know, for emergencies." "There won't be any emergencies. Can you please put it toward my debt?" "No, you really need some spare money." "It's my money, isn't it? Can't I use it the way I want to?" "Ken, what if something happens to you? You don't have any health insurance. You know Dad and I don't have a lot either." "I don't care. Just put it toward the debt. I'm begging you. Please, just put it toward the debt. You have no idea how much it bothers me. I know I sound crazy, but I want the debt gone more than anything." "You're doing great with your payments, Ken. Why do you care so much?" "I can't explain it. Just, please, put it toward the debt." "No, you really need some reserve money." "Put it toward the debt!" I screamed into the phone. "It's driving me crazy!" 5.
Okay. Oops.